I would like to talk about transition and tradition in Balint leadership. So transition comes from the Latin word transitio, excuse my accent, which means to go across, from the verb transire. According to the Oxford Dictionary, the process or a period of changing from one state or condition to another. These days, transition refers to a process of change in many spheres: social, political, gender. It's used as to transition gender, changing or moving a way of life, change of leadership, so transition in administration, in political leadership, in parliaments, or to changing transition to norms of behavior. So it has a social, cultural, political aspect as well as a personal aspect. Our thinking on transition started since Porto, and I think we were a bit inspired by Porto and the rivers of Portugal, the Atlantic Ocean, the sense of the explorers that went transatlantic and discovered or found the connection with new worlds for all its complexity of good and not so good consequences. And that's, and also sort of thinking about Serbia. It was going to be our next location, a place of obviously ongoing transitions, particularly politically, culturally, in very much still a process of transition. But what I would like to focus on is more about the transitions that are internal to the group. And the transition in the roles of the leaders. I think also Porto got us to think about some of the presentations about, well, when does a Balint group transitions into something else, which is not a Balint group? And what is the role of the leader in then working with this transition, or putting a boundary or stopping the transition? When does a Balint group begins, and when does it end? When does a support group begins, and when does it end? When does a Balint group that has patients or users involvement, is that a Balint group? Is a Balint group one that visits an art gallery or has meals? Is that part of a Balint group or not? So a lot of transitions, but also in terms of some of the theoretical underpinning of Balint work. Is there a transition from psychoanalysis to other forms of psychological views of the world or not? Of course, there's a transition in the group itself from a group of trainees, maybe to a qualified practitioners, changes in the leadership, so in transition from one leader to two leaders, or from one group member to becoming a leader, and also transition in the group itself, from maybe being more passive to being more active, and also in the leadership, maybe from being more active to being more passive. Now, the other concept I'd like to present here, to think about in relation to transition, is actually tradition. So the origin of tradition, interestingly enough, also takes into it the notion of going across. So it comes from the Latin word again, traditio, to trade or to deliver. So according to the Cambridge Dictionary, I thought I'd be fair and go to Cambridge this time. It's a belief, a principle, a way of acting that people in a particular society or group have continued to follow for a long time. And it does come from the word, sort of mix of two words, the trans, as I said, across, and the dere, which is to give. So there's something about tradition that it is about delivering something across time, across space, from person to person, from generation to generation. And it's very interesting that both include the idea of getting something across, but whether it's the something that's being passed across in tradition, or whether it's the actual process of passing across to something else that is in the transition, which implies a journey. But both in some ways convey a sense of journey. One may be more in space or identity or activity, and the other is in something that's being passed across, but maybe remains a bit more constant. But of course, the question is, does tradition and does the process of delivering something from generation to generation, does it mean it doesn't change? Does it mean it doesn't transition? Does it mean that from every generation something gets changed anyway, because you cannot pass something very frozen or rigid, but it actually has a natural dynamic evolvement? So maybe within tradition there is some conveyance already of the transition as well. But what do we think doesn't change, doesn't transit in our Balint work? So there's two main things that I'd like to mention. The first one is the frame. And however much we transition the work, and of course now we're all dealing with a very big change that we didn't think about at the time of planning this conference, and that's COVID and the transition to working virtually as opposed to in person. But the frame doesn't change. So what is kept is the time, the space, the creation of safety and trust in the group, that there is a leader or two leaders and they are designated and they continue to remain the leaders, that they are members and they also are continue to be stable, and that there are group norms and group rules that make part of the frame. And that's something we've talked a lot about in the past, about the boundaries and the rules and the norms that the leaders are responsible for. And so the frame is kept. The second thing that's kept is the ethos of what is a Balint group, the spirit of Balint work. And that is a spirit of inquiry, the spirit of curiosity, the spirit of benevolent interest in understanding something deeper, and the spirit of inclusivity, and the sense of no experts, but rather every person contribution is just as valid as everyone else's in the group and the leaders. And I think the part of the ethos, and again, it takes me back to the transition and the transatlantic notion, that it's a journey, but it's very much a journey. It's a journey to the relationship between a doctor and a patient, and also a journey into the intra space, meaning trying to understand something within the unconscious of the communication. So it's deepening and understanding, but it's a joint journey that the group and the leaders embark on together. And what is then in transition when we want to think about transition? I think the first thing is the context, the external world, which of course right now we're all very aware of it, but also the internal to the group, the context of the organization, the world of medicine, the pandemic at the moment. Where does the group take place? What is the context? What is the professional context that it could be in transition? The other one is the relationship that could be in transition. So whether it's face-to-face or whether it's virtual, also the consultation between the doctor and the patient, which could be virtual now and more and more at the moment, and the group itself, whether it's in face-to-face or virtual. The other part of the transition is, of course, the internal group dynamic. So I mentioned before, is it a support group? Is it a work group? Is it an avoidant group, or what Beyond talks about, the kind of basic assumption groups that try to defend itself from engaging with the feelings, or is it a good work group? And what is the dynamic between the leader and the co-leader, which again is quite fluid and can change and can be often in transition. And the fourth one is the notion of action versus reflection, which is an area that we are often in transition about. So it's a kind of the technical aspect of leading a Balint group. And I think about interpretation versus facilitation. I think about free association versus more direct interventions, and whether leading, what is the leader's role here to convey something about the group ability to work with the unconscious and with free association, as opposed to a bit more teaching or being a bit more directive, particularly with groups of trainees. So these are all questions to think about. I've just raised them and hope that they will help us to kind of think through the experience of the groups and the conference. Thank you.